Hey everyone, welcome to another deep dive. This time we're exploring a popular book in the teaching world, Teaching with Love and Logic
Okay.
by Jim Fay and Charles Fay.
Right.
And I know a lot of our listeners are teachers,
Mm-hmm.
so we thought this would be a great book to unpack.
Yeah.
Now, Charles Fay, one of the authors, was actually raised using these love and logic techniques.
Really?
Yeah, and he jokes that it's the reason he became a school psychologist.
That's interesting. I mean, I can see how that would be.
But to help us really unpack this book,
Mm-hmm.
we have an expert on classroom management techniques.
Well, I'm happy to be here.
So this book, it really emphasizes building positive relationships with students.
Yes.
And it's not just about rewards and punishments.
No, it's not. So often it feels like we as teachers get stuck in this cycle of rewards and consequences.
Right.
But this book, it really digs into why building those genuine connections
Yeah.
with students is so important.
Mhm.
And it's actually, the authors say that students crave those positive relationships
Right.
more than they crave those external rewards.
Mhm.
It's about making those kids feel seen and heard and valued.
I've definitely seen that in my own classroom. How just a simple good morning
Right.
or asking a student about their weekend,
Mm-hmm.
it can shift the energy in the whole classroom.
Absolutely. And actually, there's a great anecdote in the book
Oh.
about a teacher who had a really challenging student.
Okay.
And, instead of focusing on punishments for this kid,
Right.
she found ways to involve him in
Mhm.
classroom tasks, giving him a little bit of responsibility and
Oh.
helping her out.
Yeah.
And that simple act of
Yeah.
giving him that little bit of responsibility,
Right.
it built this bond between them.
Oh, wow.
And his behavior changed drastically.
That's great.
Yeah.
And that reminds me of another point this book makes,
Okay.
which is about understanding the reasons behind misbehavior.
Mm-hmm.
It's about seeing beyond the bad kid label.
Yeah, what's interesting is the authors point out that misbehavior is often like a mask for pain or insecurity.
Right?
So the kids are trying to protect themselves
Mhm.
or express unmet needs.
Yeah.
And they have an example of a teacher who had a student who was constantly cursing.
Okay.
And instead of punishing the student, she gave him a week
Oh, wow.
of helping out in the classroom.
Really?
And the kid was totally surprised by this response.
Yeah.
But it gave him a sense of purpose.
Mhm.
And his behavior improved significantly.
That's amazing how a shift in perspective like that can really
Yeah.
change things. So it's like addressing the root cause instead of
Exactly.
just reacting to the surface behavior.
Yeah.
And that brings us to
Okay.
another interesting concept in this book,
Okay.
which is thinking words versus fighting words.
Okay.
Now, those fighting words, those are the things that
Hmm.
we as teachers tend to say,
Yeah.
but we can't really enforce.
Right.
Like stop texting,
Mm.
get to work,
Yeah.
all that stuff.
Yeah. I've definitely said those words.
Oh, yeah. And it's like,
many times.
why am I even bothering?
Right.
And the book explains that those fighting words, they backfire
Right.
because they lead to power struggles,
Yeah.
because they're not actually enforceable.
It's like telling a river to stop flowing.
Right.
You can say it, but it's not going to happen.
Yeah. And I've had moments where I've said those fighting words,
Uh-huh.
and then I've ended up feeling totally powerless.
Totally.
Yeah.
The authors suggest using thinking words instead. So
Okay.
these are statements
Yeah.
that describe what you will do or allow as the teacher.
Okay.
So instead of saying stop texting,
Right.
a love and logic teacher might say cell phones are great.
Mm-hmm.
I allow them to be in the room as long as they're not causing a problem.
Right.
So it's like setting clear boundaries,
Yeah.
but in a way that gives the students
Right.
a chance to make responsible choices.
Yeah, I like that.
It is about choice.
And before we get into more of those specific techniques,
Okay.
I want to touch on another key concept from this book,
Okay.
which is empathy before consequences. I think this is something a lot of teachers struggle with.
Yeah, it's crucial. This book, it really highlights the importance of showing genuine empathy
Yeah.
before delivering those consequences.
Okay.
Because it helps the students feel understood
Mm-hmm.
and less defensive,
Yeah.
which opens the door for them to learn from that experience.
I've definitely noticed that when a student feels like I genuinely care about
Yeah.
how they're feeling,
Right.
even if they messed up,
Yeah,
they're much more likely to respond positively.
absolutely. And they have another great story in the book
Okay.
about a student who got into a fight at school.
Uh-huh.
And he was called to the principal's office,
Oh, no.
expecting a lecture. But instead, the principal started by acknowledging how tough
Right?
the situation must have been for him.
Yeah.
And that simple act of empathy
Mhm.
totally changed the student's attitude.
Wow. So reaching the student's heart.
Yes.
before addressing the behavior.
Yeah, and that leads us to another important concept in the book,
Okay.
which is sharing control within limits.
Okay.
So this is about giving students choices,
Yeah.
but within a structured environment.
Now, how does that actually work in practice? Does it mean letting them run wild?
No, not at all.
Okay.
It's about giving them that sense of ownership without giving up your authority as the teacher.
Right.
The authors suggest offering students choices
Right.
in areas that affect only the student.
Okay.
So, for example, they use this example of a father who gives his kids choices about their bedtime routine.
Okay.
You know, like which pajamas to wear
Yeah.
or which book to read.
Right.
And it seems small, but it actually made bedtime much smoother.
I've tried that with my own kids, and it really does help.
Right.
That little bit of control
Yeah,
makes them feel like they're part of the process.
exactly. And there's another great example from the book
Oh.
about a teacher who did the same thing with math assignments.
Okay.
She let the students choose which problems they wanted to work on, and it actually led to greater engagement and cooperation.
Wow. So small choices can have a big impact.
You really can.
And now, what about,
Okay.
those times when a student's behavior is really disruptive? What does the book say about that?
Well, it suggests using a technique called short-term recovery.
Okay.
Now, this is a strategy to use when a student's behavior is escalating
Right.
and they need a break to calm down.
Okay.
So it involves having the student briefly leave the classroom.
So it's not a punishment.
No, it's not a punishment.
or
It's
very-
a chance to reset.
Okay.
So like pressing pause on a heated moment.
Right. And the book has an example of a teacher who uses this technique
Yes.
to manage a really disruptive student,
Mm-hmm.
but it allows the rest of the class to continue learning.
Exactly.
So it's giving that student the space
Right.
to calm down
Yeah.
and then rejoin the class
When they're ready.
when they're ready to learn.
Exactly.
This is really making me rethink
Yeah.
some of my go-to strategies.
Yeah. And it's not about forcing an apology or
Right.
making them explain themselves
Right.
while they're still upset.
Yeah, just give them that space
Exactly.
to kind of process what's going on.
Yeah.
And this actually reminds me of a time in my classroom
Okay.
where I had a student who was refusing to do an assignment.
Uh-huh.
And instead of arguing with him or trying to force him to do it,
Right.
I asked him, what are you going to do about this?
That's a perfect example of what the book calls guiding kids to own and solve problems.
Right.
It's so much more effective than just handing them the answer.
It is. And it was amazing to see how that simple question just got him thinking.
Right.
And he actually came up with a solution that worked for both of us.
The book suggests that when we constantly rescue students from their mistakes, we're actually preventing them from learning valuable lessons.
Right.
They need to experience those natural consequences
Right.
to develop responsibility and problem-solving skills.
And it makes me think about those thinking words you were talking about.
Uh-huh.
That's about letting students know what will happen if they cross those boundaries, but without getting into those emotional power struggles.
It's about empowering them
Yeah.
to make their own choices,
Right.
even if those choices lead to some bumps in the road.
Right. And, the book talks about the idea of a control account.
Oh, yeah,
It's like we're making deposits into a bank account
right.
every time we give students a small choice.
Okay,
And then when we need to set a firm limit,
yeah.
we have that reserve of goodwill to draw on.
I love that analogy.
Yeah. Have you ever used that concept in your work?
Absolutely. Building that foundation of trust and connection with students is so essential. When students feel respected, they're much more likely to cooperate
Right.
and follow those necessary boundaries.
And the book also points out the difference between limits that affect just the student
Right.
and limits that affect others. So it's about giving them control over things they can control
Exactly.
while still maintaining that respectful learning environment for everyone.
Yes. What are your thoughts on that?
I think it's about finding that balance
Yeah.
between freedom and responsibility.
Right. A teacher might give students choices about where they sit
Yeah.
or which project to work on,
Right.
but they wouldn't let them choose whether or not to disrupt the class.
Exactly. Choices within a framework.
Yeah.
Now let's talk about those times when a student's behavior is consistently disruptive.
Okay.
What does the book say about that?
Well, the book suggests using a technique called short-term recovery.
Okay.
So this is when a student needs a break to regain control.
Right.
They temporarily leave the classroom to calm down.
So it's not about punishment.
No.
It's about giving them a chance to reset.
Exactly. And it's important to avoid choices
Okay.
that are really just threats in disguise.
Like do your work or you'll get a 0.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The book suggests offering real choices, not ultimatums.
Right.
So a love and logic teacher might say, I give full credit to assignments turned in on time.
Yeah.
What are you going to do to make sure you get credit for this?
Okay, I'm seeing the difference now.
Good.
So what about situations where a student
Okay.
is really struggling to come up with solutions on their own?
The teacher can offer some suggestions,
Okay.
but framed as what other students have tried.
Right.
That way, the student still feels ownership over that decision.
That's really helpful.
Yeah.
Now, we've talked about supporting students,
Mm-hmm.
but what about working with parents?
Oh, yeah.
That can be a whole other challenge.
It can be. One of the key insights in the book is that often difficult parents are actually grieving.
No.
They're grieving the loss of the perfect child they imagined, or the loss of their own sense of control or competence as a parent.
So their difficult behavior comes from a place of pain and frustration.
Often, yes. And when we approach those interactions with empathy,
Yeah.
it can make a world of difference.
Yeah, we need to remember that everyone is dealing with something.
Right. The book even talks about understanding the stages of parental grief,
Oh, wow.
which can help us anticipate how a parent might react
Right, Dave?
and respond in a supportive and effective way.
So if a parent is in denial about their child's behavior,
Right.
we wouldn't try to force them to accept it right away.
Exactly.
We meet them where they are.
And if a parent is angry,
Uh-huh.
we wouldn't take it personally. We would, let them vent their frustrations
Yeah.
in a safe and controlled environment.
And the book outlines a process for handling those tricky parent-teacher conferences,
Mm-hmm.
starting with listening and reflecting
Yeah.
back what we hear.
Making a parent feel heard and understood is crucial
Right.
before we even try to solve any problems.
And the book also suggests being proactive.
Okay.
Sending positive notes home.
Right.
Even just a quick email
Yeah.
can go a long way in building that trust.
Those little gestures can mean a lot
Yeah.
when parents feel like we're on their side.
Mm-hmm.
They're much more likely to be open to our suggestions.
Now, I want to circle back
Okay.
to that question we posed earlier
Mm-hmm.
about how can we use these love and logic principles
Yeah.
to equip students for a complex world.
It's about giving them the ability to think for themselves,
Right.
to solve their own problems, and to bounce back from setbacks.
And this approach seems to provide
Yeah,
a framework for doing just that.
it does. It's about empowering students,
Yeah.
helping them become resilient,
Mhm.
and nurturing their growth both academically and emotionally.
It sounds like we're not just managing behavior.
No,
We're transforming the whole classroom dynamic.
exactly.
It's amazing how much we've uncovered just by, looking at these love and logic principles.
Yeah.
But, before we wrap up, I want to
Okay.
touch on one more
Okay.
really crucial piece of this,
Okay.
which is the book's perspective on academic apathy.
Right.
We've all encountered students who just don't seem engaged,
Mm-hmm.
no matter what we try.
Yeah, that's one of those challenges that
Yeah.
can be really disheartening as a teacher.
Yeah.
But the book goes deeper,
Right.
and it argues that there's always a reason behind a student's lack of engagement.
So instead of assuming that the student is just
Right.
lazy or unmotivated,
Right.
we need to understand the root cause.
The authors highlight the importance of intrinsic motivation.
Okay.
That inner drive
Yeah.
that makes us want to learn and grow.
Right.
And it's not about external rewards or punishments. It's about fostering that curiosity
Yeah.
and a sense of ownership over learning.
Now, how do we do that?
Well, the book uses this interesting analogy comparing students to trees.
Oh, okay. I've heard this one.
It's such a powerful image.
Yeah.
When a tree's roots are strong and healthy,
Right.
it flourishes.
Right.
But if the roots are damaged or lacking nutrients,
Yeah.
the tree struggles to grow.
Right.
And the same applies to students.
Okay.
If their basic needs aren't being met,
Right.
whether it's emotional, social, or academic,
Right.
they're not going to thrive academically.
So if we see a student who's struggling, it's like noticing a tree with wilting leaves.
Exactly.
Instead of focusing on the leaves,
Right.
we need to look at the roots.
Look at the root cause.
Yeah. And the book suggests exploring a whole range of potential causes,
Mhm.
anxiety, fear of failure.
Lack of support at home,
Right.
undiagnosed learning differences.
Even just like, something going on at home that we don't know about. That's affecting their ability to focus.
There's always a story behind the behavior.
And I remember I had this student
Okay.
a few years ago, Ashton,
Okay.
and he was so bright,
Uh-huh.
but he was constantly underperforming.
Yeah.
And we tried everything.
Oh, wow.
Rewards, punishments, extra help.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing seemed to work.
The book has a similar story about a student
Yeah.
where it wasn't until the teachers really took the time to understand
Mm-hmm.
that student's needs and challenges that they actually made a breakthrough.
And in Ashton's case,
Okay.
it turned out he had this, debilitating fear of failure.
Wow.
And once we addressed that,
Yeah.
his academic performance just skyrocketed.
Oh, that's great.
And that just highlights
Yeah,
the fact that there's no one-size-fits-all solution.
right.
Every student's unique,
Exactly.
and, their struggles need to be understood and addressed individually.
And the book also talks about
Yeah.
the importance of focusing on a student's strengths.
Oh, yeah.
Instead of highlighting what they're doing wrong,
Right.
we can celebrate those successes, even the small ones.
And, we've covered so much ground today.
Yeah.
From building relationships and understanding behavior to,
Sharing control.
sharing control and guiding problem solving.
Yeah.
I'm already thinking about how I can use this
Yeah.
in my own classroom.
I think that's the beauty of this book.
Yeah.
It gives us a framework for creating a more positive and productive
Right.
learning environment.
For every
It's not just about managing behavior. It's about transforming those relationships.
And those positive changes,
Yeah.
they can extend beyond the classroom walls.
Absolutely.
These principles of empathy, sharing control, and guiding problem solving,
Right.
they're relevant in so many areas of life.
They apply to parenting relationships,
Right.
our own personal growth.
It's about recognizing
Yeah.
that we all have a need to feel,
Connected, respected.
Yeah.
Empowered.
when we approach our interactions with those values in mind,
Yeah.
I think we create a more harmonious world
Absolutely.
for ourselves and everyone around us.
Well said.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive
Yes.
into the world of love and logic.
I hope you found it insightful.
We hope you found it insightful and helpful.
And don't forget to check out the book for yourselves.
Yeah.
It's a treasure trove of wisdom
It is.
and practical advice that can transform your teaching.
Happy teaching, everyone.